Well, here we are on a new journey, and we're tackling the Apocalypse to John, commonly known as Revelation, a book that all of us have shied away from, all of us have ignored, and to think that we can unpack this in the weeks to come and make sense out of it is probably the impossible dream, but why not every once in a while take that trip? And let's remember, first of all, that the word Bible means library. So 300 years after the death of Christ, death of Jesus, the Christian church all of a sudden sort of became official because the Roman emperor converted to Christianity. So they said, we've got to decide what books are going to be in our library. And so the goal was to represent the traditions of the Christian movement from Jesus to the time that they were making this decision, 325 or so. And so they decided to include the book of Revelation. Not that anyone believed that the worldview of Revelation was true. They knew already it wasn't, and it'll become evident as we go through it that it wasn't an accurate worldview, but it was a valid part of the tradition of the early Christian movement, and so it was included in their Christian library. Now, when you look at the dialogue that took place among the early church leaders, the early Christian leaders, the patriarchs, if you will, of the faith, the only references we have that really give us a clue of why it was included, it was included because of a pervasive message of hope. And therefore, because the message was valid, it was included, even though some understandings of Revelation were already proved historically invalid. But it was a part of the tradition, so it was included. So there are 6 keys to understanding the revelation of John of Patmos. Now, Patmos was an island. He was writing a letter to Christian churches to give them hope in a very, very desperate time. And so there's 6 keys, I think, to understanding the book of Revelation, and let's name these as we begin. First of all, it is an apocalypse. That's a confusing word, it's not in our vocabulary, but what apocalypse means is it's a disclosure, an unveiling, and in this context, an unveiling of a hidden message, and therefore it is written in code language. Now, for instance, I have one of the books about the book of Revelation that I have, and it's by Bruce Metzger. And what's the title? Breaking the Code. So that's the first thing we have to understand. It was written in code, and the code was the Old Testament. And when you think of the 404 verses in the book of Revelation, there's 518 quotations from the Old Testament. So there was no way to understand it. If you didn't understand Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Daniel, you didn't have a chance to understand it. So John of Patmos could write this in code language, and the Roman officials, which were responsible for delivering the letter, wouldn't have any problem with it because it was written in code. So first of all, it's an apocalypse. Secondly, it was written from an island about the same time that Christianity was outlawed. Now, Judaism was outlawed by a Roman emperor in 167 BC, but about 95 AD or thereabouts, the Roman Emperor Domitian outlawed Christianity. So therefore, as it was written from an island, had to be transported by Roman officials to the mainland to be distributed by the Christian churches that received it. It was written in this code language. So first of all, it's apocalypse, an unveiling. Secondly, it was written from an island in a code that the Roman officials didn't understand. Thirdly, it is written with an eschatological understanding, and that big long word just simply means in things. And in this context, it has to do with the impending end of the world. John of Patmos believed the world was about to come to an end. It's eschatological in that nature. Apocalyptic, written from an island in code language, and eschatological, having to do with the end of the world. Fourth, it is a message of hope during a time of executions, uncertainty, probably devastation for all Christians. It's a message of hope. Now, in the coming weeks, we'll unpack that message of hope. We aren't going to get to that this week, but it is a message of hope. And then it is written with an understanding of a worldview which originated in Persian Zoroastrianism. Now remember, the Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greek, Roman empires, but the time under the Persian Empire, it had a great influence on the Jewish community. Number one, because Persia was in a sense a better empire because they allowed the Jews to come back to Palestine. They allowed them to rebuild the temple. But Persian Zoroastrianism sort of invaded the Jewish community, the Christian community, and centuries later, the Islamic community. Because if you look at Judaism and if you look at Daniel, parts of Ezekiel and parts of Zechariah, straight out of Persian Zoroastrianism. You look at Christianity, Revelation, straight out of Persian Zoroastrianism. If you look at Islam and understand the Shiite community in the Islam faith, straight out of Persian Zoroastrianism. Now, this worldview is fascinating, and we'll get to it a little bit later in a few minutes. But just remember, Persian Zoroastrianism was a determining factor in John of Patmos' understanding of what's going on. Finally, the sixth thing we must understand is it is written from the understanding of dualism. Dualism simply means there's two supreme beings. One on the side of good, capitalize G, and you have God. One on the side of evil, and you capitalize D, and you have the devil. You have two supreme beings vying with each other for obedience of people on earth. That's dualism. As over against monotheism, believing that there is one God, one supreme being, not two. So to understand how this happened, as the preachers that we've been looking at over the past month moved to an understanding of monotheism, there was a part of the Jewish community and a part of the Christian community that never let go of dualism. So although the majority movement was for monotheism, there was a minority segment of the community committed to dualism. And you've got to understand dualism to understand the book of Revelation. Now, Those are the 6 things that we have to remember as we approach Revelation. It is not a prediction of the 20th century. It is dealing with what was happening in 95 AD. So first of all, let's unpack. We're going to look at the code language briefly, the eschatological worldview briefly, dualism briefly, and then raise some topics for discussion. First of all, the code language. Once you get into this, it is fun, it is engaging, it is fascinating, sort of like a mystery. But let's look at just one illustration of the code language. 666 has been referred to by people in every generation of an entity like the Soviet Union when we were in the Cold War, or another country, or an individual is 666. Well, if you know the code, you can unpack this one pretty easily, because the Roman emperor that outlawed Christianity was a guy by the name of Neron Caesar. Now, in Hebrew numerology, the vowels are just dots. They are not the letters, if you will. So the numbers in the Hebrew numerology all had to do with the consonants, not the vowels. So we look at the vowels and they're on Caesar. N equals 50. R equals 200. N equals 50. C equals 100. S equals 60. R equals 200. All of a sudden you have 666. So in the code language, you see, all of a sudden, what people have interpreted as having all kinds of applications through the century, no. It has to do with that day. When he said the beast was 666, every reader of the Old Testament in the churches that received the message, all those people knew, he's talking about Neron Caesar, because they knew the code. Now, on and on, we can unpack this. Let me use just one other illustration. The beast rising from the sea had 10 horns. That's the number of Roman emperors there were. There were 7 heads. Those are the number of emperors that used the name Augustus, which means divine. 10 crowns altogether. 7 plus 3 equals 10. And a blasphemous name, Augustus, which means divine. Is there any doubt that John of Patmos was talking about the Roman Empire? No doubt at all, if you know the code. So that's our task as we move ahead through the book of Revelation. Secondly is the Persian Zoroastrianism worldview. 60 years ago, the Interpreter's Bible was published, and it put together a fascinating, simple diagram of what this worldview is all about. And this is how John of Patmos understood what was happening in the world. First of all, there's the creation, there's the fall of sin, and all of a sudden in 95 AD, you have the end of the world and the persecution that is going to take place. And this is the event. And for 1,000 years, the martyrs in the time of the first resurrection, the martyrs would reign with God. So they would have a reward for their faithfulness. And then during this 1,000 years, the devil was tied up, But then after 1,000 years, the devil would be unleashed. There would be all kinds of conflict between the devil and God. And it looked like the devil was going to win right here. But then there would be a second resurrection of all people. And the faithful would be rewarded in the presence of God. And the unfaithful would experience punishment. That's simply the worldview and the way that the world was interpreted by John of Patmos, anticipating any moment or any day the first resurrection would be taking place, and the faithful martyrs would have the reward, 1,000-year reign with God and Jesus. Now, this worldview has been been the guidance for many religious expressions through the centuries and many political movements, because all you have to do is to take this worldview and fiddle with it a little bit and realize that when things are really going terrible and not your way, there's going to be an event with divine intervention, and you will be rewarded if you're faithful to the cause. So it's applied religiously, it's applied politically, down through the 20 centuries. But John of Patmos was applying this to 95 AD. And that's the worldview, and we'll see it played out throughout the book of Revelation. Finally, dualism. We've talked about this before. We've talked about the existence of opposing supreme beings. And the difference is when you have the devil and God vying with each other, and that's where the fight is, and people have the choice of following the commands of the devil or following the commands of God. And so the choice of human beings, whose orders am I going to follow? Whose orders are we going to follow? The devil or God? Whereas if you have one supreme being, the responsibility of people is far simpler. And that is, you don't have to decide who you're going to obey, whose commandments and orders you're going to follow. All you're called to do is what is right. You're not called to follow orders as you are in dualism. You're simply called on to do right, which is established by the one God of love. Now, John of Patmos was a dualist, and we have to remember that as we work through the book. So this is sort of the foundation of the book of Revelation, and it will be fun to discuss it. So, for discussion, first of all, what does the idea of breaking the code have on your attitude towards the book of Revelation? Does it change it? Secondly, what are the historic and current day 2021 illustrations of the worldview of Revelation empowering political and religious movements? It happens in every age, including our own. Thirdly, what happens to this adherent of the worldview when the event, John of Patmos, it was the first resurrection, but when the event does not happen as predicted? Finally, dualism removes human responsibility for hatred, injustice, and fragmentation laced with hostility. Human beings following short of the way of love can always be excused. The devil made me do it. Okay? The question is, to what extent does dualism determine the immaturity of human behavior, defined by some as the unwillingness to accept the consequences of our own behavior? In other words, does dualism prevent Christian maturity? There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to think about. But I will use this in all of our inquiry about the book of Revelation. Just remember, when there is disaster and despair, hope rises. In times of disease and distancing, hope rises. In a moment, a star rises, and hope is born. Welcome to the journey. We'll talk about it Sunday.